students! In this lesson, we're going to learn about movement and editing. So let's dive right in, as these are instrumental elements of film. So, interestingly enough, the, the word cinema comes from the Greek word for movement, kinema. So that's indicates just how central movement is to cinema. If at its very essence, the word means movement from Greek. So, movement is not just what happens, but how it happens. And this is the work of the director, and they decide how they will interpret movement. So, some different types of movement that we have naturalistic versus stylized. So, naturalistic movement mimics real life. It's what we see when characters um, move and carry themselves in a way that mimics real life. Now, stylized movement is more choreographed, exaggerated, or symbolic. I can't help but think of like in musicals or in scenes where there's singing and dancing, and also it's one thing to note. So when you're watching a movie, if it is naturalistic or more stylized in the scene that you are viewing. So the other part of movement that we talk about is literal versus symbolic. When a movement is literal, it means exactly what it shows. There is no hidden meaning or metaphor. But when a movement is symbolic, this movement represents something beyond that physical action. For example, many times in film, the environment can represent how the character is feeling. Like if there is a movement of wind, it can represent the character's rage in that instance. I've seen Akira Kurosawa do it a lot in his films. Movement in film is not simply a matter of what happens. What differentiates a great director from a merely competent one is not so much a matter of what happens, but how things happen. So, once again, directors are intentional with the types of movement that they employ within their work. So, interestingly enough, when we have this movement, there's a psychological meaning that it evokes. For example, an upward movement can indicate joy, aspiration, or power. A downward movement can indicate grief, death, or weakness. Curved or swaying can be feminine or graceful. Straight and direct could be masculine and intense. When there's a movement toward the camera, like if a character is moving toward the camera, it could be threatening or inviting, depending on who is moving toward the camera. Let's say it's a villain that is moving toward the camera and it is physically invading your space as a viewer, then it can be threatening. But if it's a beautiful character, then it can be inviting. If the movement is away from the camera, there's a sense of withdrawal or distance as the character fades into the shot. So remember, think of it that movement carries psychological meaning. I know that last time we talked about color, and so also movement, surprise, surprise, carries psychological meaning. Now, a little bit of different camera movement types that directors use. One is panning, which is when there's horizontal scanning. A tilt is vertical movement. And this one, whenever directors use a dolly to move with the action, they track the action with a dolly. That is something that Steven Spielberg does a lot, and his shots are very characteristic of his, using tracking and using the dolly to move with the action. That's so Steven Spielberg that comes to mind. Another camera movement type can be raw, can be a handheld one that indicates it's raw and immediate. I think of scenes where the character has taken a the camera and is maybe documenting their reality, then that feels more raw and immediate. A crane sweeping airborne. Zoom, we can zoom in and out, right? Or we can get a bird's eye view, an aerial view. So all of this are moves that directors take when they're moving the camera. Also, some other things that they do, a freeze frame, it suspends time and emphasizes the moment. When something is slow motion, there's many instances of like a runner is running slowly, or maybe there's a war movie where um, something is happening. So it really draws our attention as viewers to what is happening in that scene. Of course, when there are fast motion movement distortions, then they can be comedic or mechanical. I can't help but think of the old silent films, or or even the Three Stooges, right? When they have this comical behavior. Another one, reverse motion, when we see things move back in time, the time is being manipulated. Or even another one, frame by frame construction, sometimes in animation. So, this is something to recognize that not only do directors have different ways of moving the camera, but also different distortions that they can create, like freezing the frame, or slow motion, or fast motion, or going in reverse. And these are all intentional moves by the directors. So, there's a lot in the toolbox that they can do. Now, we blend this movement to editing. And from our reading, we saw the foundation of film art is editing. And because this class is film as literature, I liked thinking of the editing as the cinema's syntax. So, syntax is word order, how we put things together, right? Is the editing. And literally, with editing, you're joining strips of film, that's what you're doing physically, or artistically, you're creating meaning through the sequence, through the rhythm that you create. It also eliminates unnecessary time and space where things are able to meld together nicely and can be fluid. It can also connect ideas through association. So we move to this idea of editing and we blend it together with the concept of movement. So D.W. Griffith is considered the father of film. He is credited for making editing and art through his film The Birth of a Nation from 1915. And some key techniques of his classic cutting, of this classic editing, include things such as close up for psychological impact, different types of shot sizes, parallel editing when we're cross cutting between locations, one thing to the next. And this, for example, creates suspense or shows simultaneity when things are happening at the same time. So that is what we think of when we're editing, where we have a means in mind that we're wishing to achieve. So the Soviet filmmaker Lev Kuleshov is created with this method called Soviet montage, which is still employed in films today. And that is when you pair um, gestures on the face with a particular object. Like, for example, in films, when we see a face and soup, maybe that can indicate hunger, or a face and coffin, grief, or a face and a child, joy. So, these things, like, I can't help but think of like in face and soup when a family's going hungry and maybe there's just a little bit of soup left and it zooms into the faces of the family. So the meaning's in the juxtaposition, not individual shots. When you pair things together, there is meaning within those shots. So, one thing to note is that when it comes to editing, we have two main editing philosophies. We have the formalist one, which Sergei Eisenstein belonged to, and realist, which Andre Bazin belonged to. So, with formalism, the director wants to manipulate editing for ideological impact. So, there is a tendency to collide shots together, and that is with formalism. And I like this picture here. There's a lot happening. With realism, that is the opposite of that. So rather than manipulating editing for impact, this realism seeks to present reality as closely as possible. So wanting to preserve reality. And in these instances of realism, in this type of editing, they would try to do long takes. So that's one thing to know. I like this picture here. It's just representing reality as it is, right? Not necessarily seeking to manipulate things through editing, right? Now, we talked about, once again, we're talking about the language of cinema, and in this lesson, how we blend together both movement and editing. So that really results in meaning. This creates the cinema's language. So I have some examples for you of what blending movement and editing looks like in very common scenes, such as when we slow reverse a camera with fragmented shots. So the shots are being fragmented, they're being cut, and it's maybe slow reverse camera. And that is an example of the horror reveal. My mind just instantly goes to Jaws when we are getting a close up of the shark, right? Or even something like a slow motion dance and long takes when it's all shot right at once. And so this is the love scene that we know, that romantic euphoria, romantic timelessness that we see represented in many films. Another one, of course, when we see fast lateral movement or running blended with rapid parallel editing back and forth, right? There's a sense of breathless urgency and panic, and that's the chasing that we see so much in film. So these are some examples of how movement and editing creates meaning. So that is something to remember. If we think about literature as film, think of movement as the diction, which is what words will you use, right? What elements will you use, the word choice. And editing is syntax, is word order. So think of movement as the diction, like what words will you use? And think of editing as the syntax. How will you order them? And together, that becomes cinema's unique language. And it's never just about the story, not just what happens, but how it happens, blending both movement and editing. And as you're watching film and as you're going to see the next movie and you're considering how movement and editing work in conjunction with one another, in terms of movement, ask, okay, why is the camera moving in this instance? Or why is it still? What does this movement or lack of movement in this scene suggest emotionally? When it comes to editing, think about how much cutting there is, and why, and what rhythm is created. Does it manipulate or allow for interpretation? Of course, once again, when we're manipulating editing, that is more um, in tune with formalist type of editing. But when things are not manipulated, they're allowed for interpretation. That is more realism, right? So formalism and realism editing is something to remember. So I hope that you enjoy this lesson and our topic on movement and editing.